Welcome to We Have Issues, a podcast where we examine important issues throughout the educational community. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Our featured guest today is author, activist, visionary, and change agent, Kass Miner. Kass Miner is an inclusive educator and community organizer who is deeply involved in local, inquiry-based teacher research and school community development. Alongside partnerships with the University of Chicago, Teachers College Inclusive Classrooms Project, the Author Village, and the New York City Department of Education since 2004, she has worked as a teacher, staff developer, adjunct professor, speaker, and documentarian. Kass reads books like other people listen to albums, and the classroom is her concert space. While Kass is organizing work in school communities is inspired by her North Stars, Miles Horton and Fannie Lou Hamer, her pedagogy is centered in joy from the communities that surround her and motivated by the idea that every adult can teach and every student can learn. Teacherhood, paired with motherhood, has driven her love of information sharing and redefining who gets to be a knower in the fiery world we live in today. She is the author of Teaching Fiercely, Spreading Joy and Justice in Our Schools. As stated in her media kit, here's a bit of information about Kass Miner's book. Quote, for modern educators, teachers, school administrators, and education policymakers, Teaching Fiercely enables educators, kids, and families to spread joy and justice in our schools. Miner's inspiring and practical exploration of what it means to be a just teacher creates space for educators to unlearn patterns that incentivize injustice in the current reality of school. Readers will follow a heartfelt yet strategic journey that moves through the historic, personal, professional, and curricular movement, catalyzing human-centered care and joy in classrooms everywhere, centering students at the core, unquote. Kass Miner, it is an absolute pleasure and an honor to welcome you to We Have Issues.
Thank you so much, Joe, for this invitation. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, one of my favorite longtime educators. And I'm also just so excited to be in conversation with lots of other educators who are really working so hard to navigate this complicated terrain we are working through in our educational world today.
We face some challenges, but we face them eagerly. Kass, let's get right into our interview. Need to give our folks some background from your book, Teaching Fiercely, Spreading Joy and Justice in Our Schools, because it opens with a quote from author and educator Sarah K. Ahmed. And Sarah asserts that, quote, to be an educator is to understand that universally, education has always been and always will be the most powerful reciprocal tool individuals, gatherings, and communities can both receive and contribute in society. It is critical to breaking cycles of crises, illiteracy, poverty, hunger, violence in all forms, armed conflict, and large-scale environmental and human tragedy. It is both the foundation and pillar of human sustainability. Educators also painfully understand that level of progress is not universally welcomed, unquote. She goes on to say, quote, this positionality only raises her awareness of patterns of systemic inequities that play out on the backs of kids and caregivers everywhere, unquote. Educator, cinematographer, and writer Phil Lane observes, to add a little bit to this, quote, the longest road you will ever walk is the journey from your head to your heart, unquote. So, Kass, how does this quote capture the essence of your vision and the work that you're doing?
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much for that, Joe. I wanted to start with this quote, this epigraph from Phil Lane, because I think there's a really interesting relationship that we all have to school. So, for example, we start school, some of us at the age of 3, to the age 6, and we start from this really curiosity based, heartfelt space where we are loving our teachers for the most part and having these very interactive and emotional experiences with our peers. And that is an honored point in curriculum when we are at those very early ages in our school lives. What we know from research is that as we experience more years of schooling, there is an inverse relationship between our creativity and between our love of learning and how much years we spend in school. And the same is true for teachers. The longer we spend in school, there can be an adverse effect in terms of how we think about ourselves as teachers. So, Joe, you are quite the exception in the educator space, right? And so I really wanted to honor that same experience we all had when we were 3, 4, 5 years old in school. We approached the learning space from a space of curiosity and love and friendship. And what I have witnessed through my almost 20 years of my teaching life is that that has eroded, and it erodes because of the kinds of structures and the kinds of data that we educators are, I won't say forced, but we educators are obligated to report, right? And so I really wanted to unpack this beautiful space that we have from our hearts and our guts, that instinctual knowing, that emotive knowing, and how does that find a home in this place we call school? Because I believe that is how we evoke justice and how we marry that with joy. I don't know that there is any other way to do it authentically. And I think with strategy, we can do it together. And so that is why I wrote Teaching Fiercely. And that is why I started with this really, open quote, right? We got to come back. We are always in this headspace. How do we move back to our heart when we think about school transformation?
I think about Georgia Hurd and I think about her heart maps. And I
Mm,
also think about the fact that you speak about joy and the joy that a youngster has going to school for the first time, and that sense of wonder that is as much part of that joy as anything. I think the wonder uh, feeds the joy. It fuels it,
mm, right.
and the positivity that's felt in those elementary grades with the added pressures, maybe as you're saying, this is taking the edge off of some of the learning and changing uh, the enthusiasm, maybe just draining some of that enthusiasm from where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also would say that I think it is this, this parallel between how schools have been by design situated in westernized dominant culture, right? Which has eroded some of the more intuitive ways of learning. So in my book, I really work hard to surface, there's indigenous pedagogies like the circle, for example. How many classrooms do we know across the United States or Canada, or what we call the United States and Canada, that have circles, right? That comes from indigenous pedagogies. And so we have a whole people in this land who have figured out relational learning in really powerful ways. And yet we also have this institution we call school who really poses a barrier to that kind of learning. Like the circle happens in the morning usually, and then it, sort of dissipates through the rest of the day. But my question is, how do we honor and acknowledge like these really powerful ways of teaching and learning that completely have a home in schools, but only if we make it, right? And so how do we legitimize these classroom structures that are really powerful ways to build relational learning in a space that has been dominated by this sort of like transactional relationship? Like, learning is pretty conditional in schools. Like you're rewarded only if, you complete the work, you do the assignment, you are quiet, you're compliant. So I really wanted to unpack those things and show that there are other ways we can design learning experiences for and with kids.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me as if you're saying that what we need to do is take the energy that is already in place, but use it in a different way so we create synergy instead.
Absolutely. I think synergy is so important, but I'm also, Joe, I really want to look a little bit deeper, right? Because in order to do that work, we educators really have to understand who we are on many different aspects, right? Who we are on our as our personhood, our identities, how those things matter in context to the demographics or the relationships we're creating with students. We have to think about how our school is situated, what are the community's beliefs versus ours as an individual educator. And so I absolutely want to work towards synergy, but sometimes I think, going back to this, how we intellectualize school, I think sometimes people will make a goal like, we're going to develop community, but you can't develop community unless you know who you are as an individual and what you believe in, and not just on the surface level, but like truly know who you are and why you're here as a teacher from a place of authenticity and deep conviction.
So it's a synergy with a restructuring as well. And it sounds
Absolutely.
like you're saying without the restructuring, the synergy is cosmetic.
Absolutely. Cosmetic and performative. And we know like that just doesn't change schools. It might look pretty and it might sound pretty, but kids are showing us the same outcomes for the past, 100 years.
That leads me back to your introduction in Teaching Fiercely. You speak of attempting to address the needs of your students by engaging them in the curriculum through the use of project-based engagements, which is
Mm,
different than rote learning. It's different than exercise learning and worksheets and
mhm.
the typical measurables, everything
Right.
being measurable in the traditional way. We measure things no matter what. We have rubrics for everything,
Yeah.
but it's that tradition. So early in your career, I understand that the school at which you taught in Brooklyn, New York, was part of the New York State Performance Standards Consortium. And the philosophy was to place emphasis on project-based learning and assessments.
Hmm.
In New York City, consortium schools were exempt from taking all of the regents, and instead, students were given the opportunity to present an inquiry project, and it was presented to a roundtable of teachers and
Hmm.
community members. I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of wisdom in bringing the community in because now they're part of the solution.
Right.
So they become uh, active agents and productive agents in that structure. The consortium relied mainly on the philosophy of John Dewey, a proponent of the project based instruction.
Hmm.
And that prepared students for the challenges of life by training them to think and create by solving real world problems. And the one that I read about in your book that I loved
Hmm.
is the research of the Gowanus Canal,
Yep.
which is a Superfund site. And the students could then find out exactly what contaminants were surrounding some of their homes.
Hmm.
This was not only practical, it was immediate.
Hmm.
So there are critics everywhere.
Sure.
And there are those who will say standardized tests are the necessary tools to measure learning in the classroom. And we need accountability of the educators and we need accountability of the students. What do we say to those folks?
It's a really complex issue, right? So talk about like instinctual knowing, right? So I have, of course, been involved in standardized testing in many different ways. First, as a classroom teacher, right? So when I started teaching, I was a secondary school teacher. So I taught mostly grades 9 through 12, a little bit of seventh grade as well. And in that school that I worked in that you mentioned, Joe, we were a consortium school. And so consortium schools kids still have to take the ELA and math regents. However, they are exempt from science, history, and any world languages that they're taking.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I started teaching from that experience, right? And so I have students, and this is a school in Brooklyn. The demographic is primarily Latinx, Black Afro-Caribbean students. And to have this deep connected experience to their everyday, right? So we have kids who live in very close proximity to the Gowanus Canal, literally one of the most polluted water sites in the world. And they have never really understood that. They never really knew that until we started talking to them about it. And then they started researching it. And then they started to gain some power because of their knowledge. They now knew that these contaminants were surrounding their homes that were potentially impacting their livelihood. There's something really beautiful about witnessing students become empowered to solve the problems that immediately surround their community. And so then fast forward a few years, I started teaching elementary school. I started teaching 4th and 5th grade. And I don't know of any elementary school in New York City that is exempt from standardized tests. And so then you have students who are, bright and just so connected to their neighborhoods. And yet, like when March rolls around, it's like a complete change in environment. And even we did the best we could and to help students understand that, this is not the be all end all. You still have a community of parents and people and caregivers who are committed to their kids doing really well on this test because that's the narrative that is sold to them, that in order to be successful, you are literate only if you do well, if you can score well on this test. You are literate only if you can score out of these, English language learning exams. And so what you start to witness is like, I call it educational theft. Kids are getting robbed of rich learning experiences every spring, February, March, April. And if you're in a school that is, their funding is incumbent upon data points in those tests, kids are getting robbed of even more enriched instructional time. And so furthermore, I would point people to the test themselves. If we had a more accurate source that could really help us understand what kids needed to grow their literacy, to grow their phonemic awareness, I'd be all about it. But I have yet to see a standardized test that is really helping teachers understand what kids need instructionally. So to the people who say that we need standardized tests to understand what kids need to do, then let's make better tests at least, because right now they're not serving kids' interests by any means. And in fact, they're stealing a lot of powerful instructional time from kids every single year. And depending on what school you're in, there's more time robbed of you.
I'm hoping personally that the tests would be used for diagnostic purposes. And once you know what the student knows, then you can progress from that point. But most teachers, and I'm sure you and I would agree on this, know in the first week what areas your students really need to work on and what areas your students have as strengths. And there are those exceptions it takes a little bit longer to find out about. But if we at least put skill bases together and we knew what strengths students come in with, and if they know certain skill areas, why are we testing them every year on the same thing? Because they already know those things. Maybe we need to be a little more efficient in the way we gather our data and then apply it a little more creatively, because being standardized to try to reach creativity seems to be counterpunctual.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Joe. And one of the things I talk a lot about in teaching fiercely is this idea of teacher agency, right? Like, why not trust teachers to make decisions about the various diagnostics or our ways of assessing kids they can do together school-wide or department-wide to really help illuminate children's strengths, children's weaknesses, and identify like a powerful way to attend to those needs. Here in New York City, we had a slew of standardized tests, everything from emotional data to reading diagnostics, and teachers had zero say in which diagnostics or tests they should use. Rather, it was like this mandated reporting, and teachers received little training. The data was confusing. It, again, is one of these things that takes away a lot of valuable instructional time between teachers and kids. So I am not against diagnostics by any means. I am not against an assessment that can authentically identify what children need. However, I think overwhelmingly the standardized assessments and tests that are given in school spaces do not help teachers, families, and kids understand the strengths and weaknesses that children are showing. And it also has a tendency to ignore or omit what children are able to do, which is also something that, again, is dominated by, westernized dominant schooling.
I'm going into the first chapter of your book now because you have a rationale for design of a structured generator of hope, and it seems to be a logical transition here. Now,
Sure.
you state that, quote, we begin with building a structure that allows us to create more joyful and just communities that we belong to, that we are in partnership with, whether they be young people or adults. This is our radical hope work, unquote. And you finish up the statement by posing the question, how can hope be radical? And you conclude that, quote, the idea of creating some type of structure like a generator with a bit of an engine behind it, built communally, packed with rituals, nourishment, and dreams that can be made real to keep us going in our pursuit toward justice, a structured generator of hope is absolutely sensational. And with communal development, it's also conceivably possible, unquote. So, how do we create this generator and have it more accepted by the school communities?
Yeah. So I wanted to begin with this idea of radical hope, and I really wanted to be very clear about what it is I was moving towards and what it is I wanted to move away from. And that work, some people might name it vision-driven justice. That work comes from Dr. Jamila Lyscott. And I think so often in school spaces, we are really good at identifying problems, right? Like we know we know the populations of people and kids that have disproportionately fared worse in schools. We know that, right? But what are we going to do about it? What is it that we want for all children? And what is it that we need to do for kids who have been disproportionately underserved throughout the centuries of public education or schooling in general? And so in the book, you'll see a very clear visual imagery of that structured generator of hope. And on the left-hand side, I have listed out the dominant ways of schooling, right? Which is quiet, surveilled, production-oriented, competitive, etc. And then in the center, you have the gears. Like, what are the things that we need to move away from this dominant culture, right? And so you have joy, justice, and agency. And there's various things that we need to build joy, right? Like teachers, educators need to be fed, like their souls need to be nourished. So we cannot always have meeting agendas that require output. Rather, we need to have meetings that are somewhat agenda-less, except for to understand what teachers need and then source them with that sustenance. I think agency is really important too. So often educators are being told what to do. So developing a communal force that provides teachers information, resources, authentic professional experiences that really help them figure out who they are in this work and what they need is imperative. But Joe, I feel like the most important part in the work of sustaining radical hope, of building a generator, is understanding what it is we're working towards. So for me, I have been in partnership with so many school communities across the country, many of which are situated here in New York City. But I know that what I'm working towards, what I have witnessed be successful in school communities, what I have researched deeply to know produces more powerful, authentic outcomes for kids and teachers, is relational learning, collaboration, spaces that allow for process instead of products. I know that I want a communal energy to be situated as priority in schools. And so I think to begin to build a generator, you have to identify first who you are and then who you are as a we in the school, and then identify what you're working towards. And from there, you can really pour into those different gears, because what you're doing with a generator, I write about this in the book, but generators don't actually form new energy. Rather, they recycle energy. And that's the thing that powers the generator, right? And so for me, part of this work is taking the resources that already exist and reshaping them into structures that work for the community, that are really charged and feeding into the kids that we're serving, and that are acknowledging the experiences and needs that teachers have in order to do the work of building joy and justice.
This is a good time to go back to Jonathan Lear, who
Sure.
has studied Native American life extensively.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees the concept of radical hope as, quote, our best weapon against despair, even when despair seems justifiable. It makes the survival of the end of your world as you know it possible.
Mm.
So let's take a moment and think about this concept. While you acknowledge that Lear's take on radical hope is a bit intense, you nonetheless describe the concept as, quote, a powerful way to describe the pursuit toward building justice, joy, and teacher agency within schools. Essentially, we do want to end the way schools operate as we know it, unquote. What are the advantages if we can end these standard ways that schools have operated over the years? Do we gain something immediately? Does it take a lot of time, and the passage of time might have things go back into an even worse space than we were at before? What's the process?
Well, the process is messy. I will acknowledge first. It's interesting, right? Like, a lot of people have different perspectives on how to engage in school transformation. For me, I wanted to name that it is radical work. Like, essentially, we are taking the institution of school and reshaping the internal mechanisms that have historically made it run pretty well. I mean, well for some, for many, many years. And so the radical part comes from this belief that it can be markedly different. But to do that work, we have to understand that what it is we are engaging in is something that we haven't experienced ourselves. Like, I went to school starting in the 80s, right? And when I was in school, I sat in a row in every single classroom in my elementary school. The only group work I ever experienced was like reading groups. I always had to raise my hand in discussion. I never there was no free form or sort of like just inquiry-based learning. Like, that wasn't something I experienced. And so as a teacher, to think about, oh my gosh, like, how do I create these inquiry-based learning experiences that are centered on students' wonderments? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so to do that work, I have to imagine things that I haven't experienced. And so I have to trust people to help me get through that process. I have to trust the children I work with, and I have to trust their questions to be meaningful. And I think the radical part comes in when it's like, well, there's like a hesitancy to try things that we don't have experience in or haven't seen before, or maybe like other people are not talking about, or maybe even other people are like, why are you doing that? Why is your room so chaotic? There's a lot of stuff like that comes from engaging and reshaping school or transforming your classroom practice. Or even if you're a school leader, if you are giving permission for people for teacher groups, for example, to create their own meeting agendas. You might have principals surrounding you. Well, you can't give teachers time and space to identify how they're going to spend their time. They're going to waste it. Like, there's a lot of comments like that come from trying to do things a little bit differently. And I think if more people had the stance that this work is radical, this means we have to try things we have not yet experienced ourselves. And we just need to stay committed and see how it goes. And just like any other inquiry process, it's a cycle. Not everything is going to work perfectly. Not everything is going to change immediately. But if we really stay committed to the work, if we have a community of people who are invested and committed to that future goodness, right? Like, I am really committed to developing relational learning in my school. From a research perspective, the primary change agent in a kid who has experienced like really terrible school, a kid who has produced like, not great outcomes on the report card, maybe the child has an IEP, maybe the child has been labeled emotionally disturbed. The change agent in that child's experience overwhelmingly is that they had a powerful relationship with a teacher. So think about what it means if every child has an opportunity to experience a powerful relationship with a teacher through every single period of their school day. So when people say, like, why are we focused on relational learning? I can speak back to them because this is one of the most powerful ways we can change outcomes for kids who have experienced 9 other years of really terrible experiences in school. And it's doable, right? Like, I'm not saying that everybody has to learn, physics or whatever is super challenging. Like relational learning, like having a connection with kids, having a connection with each other, like that is like, it's incredible, right? And Joe, I would argue that your sustainability in this profession, I'm guessing, is because of the relationships you've been able to cultivate with kids over
Definitely.
time in your school experience.
I love doing what I do, and you know that, and you love doing what
Yeah.
you do, and all of us who stay in as long as we do feel that we're making a difference, and that's the key. Let me go to your paradigm of our educational system,
Mm.
and you keep saying that we need to have a paradigm that has justice, that has equality, that has diversity, that's valued. And we need to, and I'm going to pull a quote from your book, we need to invest, quote, our whole selves, including building our imaginative capacities, our abilities to be fully present in school spaces, and also reifying our stance and purpose within the highly publicized components of justice, joy, and teacher agency. And unquote. It seems that unless these approaches are at least considered, if not completely adopted in one piece, that we don't stand much of a chance of making a difference. If we look at the need to make a change and we want to do this, even though we have a highly politicized environment where justice, joy, and teacher agency isn't being recognized in the way that it needs to, that our chances of making a difference, of changing the dynamic, the structure, uh,
Mm.
the diagram of where we are and where we need to be really is being compromised. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the compromise component is absolutely accurate. And I think that the difference here is like the level of transformation you're hoping for, right? I think that sometimes schools make this goal to transform into a space that is centered um, in social justice, that is honoring like the joyful and abundant spaces that kids live in, and they're going to develop that in their schools. But I think again that oftentimes the transformation is situated in the intellectualization of school. So you can't necessarily like just meet and theorize about or read a bunch of texts that are representative of the human demographic, right? Like you can honor all of the different months. You can honor Hispanic Heritage Month. You can honor Black History Month. You can honor Indigenous Peoples Month. You can honor AAP and HI Month, right? But unless you are interrogating who you are as individuals, who you are as a people, and you are authentically examining the relational exchanges that are happening in classrooms, that content that you are honoring, those people who you are honoring, it is like almost a moot point. I just saw educator Dr. Dina Simmons. She runs Liberate Ed, capital ED at the end. And she showed us a video of a teacher's classroom who had a socio-emotional learning clearly displayed in her classroom. She had the calm down corner. The kids had the feelings words. They were able to articulate how they felt in their language. And yet the teacher is screaming at this child, is using this acerbic tone when she is speaking to the child and invites the child to go to the calm down corner, right? So my point is that you can have these things named, you can engage with them as a community, but the real transformation comes when you are really honoring your folks, your people who are in your building as whole people. And you can't do that unless you know who you are yourself as a whole person, right? So the work is a lot deeper than people pay homage to, the work with a capital W, right? And so in this book, that is really what I'm trying to clarify, right? That it is an individual reflection, it's a communal reflection, and Joe, it is not discounting that our instructional methodology is also important. You have to know how to teach what you're teaching and why you're teaching it, right? So if you have a really incredible read aloud you want to do with kids, well, why did you choose that read aloud? And then when you're doing the read aloud, like what kinds of questions are you asking? And how are you also building on foundational literacy practices that children need to adopt and understand to become independently literate, right?
And with all the variables in place, I would think that someone listening to this would be ill-advised to rush out and try to change 100% of the way they do things 100% of the time, because students at any level will see that the person is out of his or her comfort zone, and that will compromise the instruction. But I remember a quote from that my mentor used to tell me all the time. He went for his doctorate in administration and supervision at Columbia. And so he had Professor Yanni as one of his professors, and he adored the way Professor Yanni would teach his classes, because he would send people out to do real world things. And he said, Professor Yanni always told the class that you need to make change, but before you can make any change that's significant, you have to change the way people are relating to each other. Until you can do that, everything else you try is going to be compromised or is going to be a failure. You'll just be frustrated. And I've carried that with me for all these years. I heard that maybe 40 years ago.
That's so powerful, Joe. And I hope people really take that to heart, because I think the expectation that things will be different after we try things like one time, or after we ourselves have named that we are committed to doing our work differently. I think we have to honor how learning works, right? And all learning starts from schema, right? Going back to educational theory and Vygotsky and all those guys, right? We have to start from a place of schema. We want to honor our zone of proximal development. And we learn in chunks, right? All knowledge is built from previous knowledge. And if you don't have previous knowledge on whatever it is you're trying to do, then it's not going to be successful. And so I would just charge people to be really authentically committed. And if you're authentically committed, then your learning is going to become organic, and the kinds of experiences that you are creating for yourself and with your community. And primarily, if you're a teacher, that learning is going to come from a kid-facing kind of way, and it will feel interesting, not great all the time, but that's all learning, right? That productive struggle, that's where it happens. And that's where so many folks tend to shy away. So if you can get through that productive struggle, that's the growth, right? And it's really cool. And unfortunately, I think so often there's an expectation that transformation is going to come in clean lines and sparkly packages, and it just doesn't.
Reflection and collaboration seem to be keys in the way that you're structuring this approach. And I admire the fact that you acknowledge that this is not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen in a weekend, that it takes time, but it also takes a commitment. It's not something that you can try out some days, but not use other days, because the message sent to your students will be a completely confusing one, and it might cause you more problems than had you just maintained what you were actually doing in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that, transparency is also key. And I know that, there's varying levels of safety depending on, where you're working at and, what kind of grown-ups are surrounding the communal space. But I have always had great success with children in particular when I have been very forthright in what I'm committing to and what I'm trying to do. Um, and to and to a certain extent also with families. I've never been secretive of anything in my practice. And I think part of what's made change powerful for me is that again, the commitment comes from a complexity of experiences, right? It's the study in the book, it's the conversations with the people, and then it's a recognition that this is not going to be pretty necessarily. And then that's okay. It's okay if it's not pretty because I know why I'm doing this and I'm committed to growing and making it better and different for the children that are in front of me.
We have barely scratched the surface of the information that's in your book. That book could be read multiple times and new things and new insights pulled each and every time. And I know for the limits of time, we need to move this along. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about building a thought sanctuary where one may collaborate, nurture, build, and reflect, because that seems to be a foundational piece in this whole vision. And we've talked a little bit about the barriers, but how did you come up with the idea that we need a thought sanctuary, and what are the end products that you hope to come from those?
Yeah. So first, the idea of thought sanctuary for me, that maybe that name, the labeling of it is new, but a thought sanctuary for me is what has sustained me throughout my educational life, especially my teaching career. And without those thought sanctuary spaces, I would not be where I am today. And I wanted to name this space thought sanctuary because we contain multitudes, right? Walt Whitman, we contain multitudes. And I think that teachers are often, coming together and there's like a very specific thing that teachers are meant to talk about. But I think that authentic learning and inquiry-based experiences require a level of connectivity, and they also require us to tap into our abundant knowledges that we bring with us that aren't necessarily truncated in like a teacher preparation program or even in most PDs, right? And so I wanted to name that teachers and educators need spaces to come together that are not agendaed by other, sort of like systemic top-down kind of initiatives, but rather teachers come together and identify what it is they are interested in talking about, what kinds of ideas they're coming up with, how they might grow those ideas. Like I named one of the most powerful thought sanctuaries for me was when I taught elementary school in Sunset Park, and every Thursday, the fourth grade team would come together and we would just chat about all of the things we were experiencing in our classrooms. We would help each other solve problems. We would talk about our children. We would bring new foods for one another to meet. And while that sounds like, I know that sounds like, but Kass, you're just having fun with your teacher friends. Yes, and we're also building this safe space where we can authentically describe the challenges we're experiencing with families and with kids in our classrooms that we do not necessarily feel like we can bring up in other spaces in the school. And so the thought sanctuary comes from, and it's like a necessity, and also something I had the privilege of just being surrounded by just incredible people that really fed into my soul and really helped me build my craft without judgment, but rather from a space of like, we are in this with you. We want the same thing as you. So let's figure this out together. And so I think if we were more intentional about creating those spaces, we would have a really different school experience, not just teachers, but also kids.
It almost sounds as if you're advocating an advisory for adults.
Oh, yeah, kind of, yeah. And Joe, it's funny that you say that because there's a very popular conference, Resi, here at Columbia University every summer, and they actually have advisories that you are situated in throughout the conference. So you have your keynotes and your workshops in the morning, and then in the afternoon you come together in an advisory. They used to call them pool parties. I'm not sure they call it now, but it's a space to unpack, get to know other people in a smaller group so you can process your learning in a space that's not full of all of this like pressure to understand immediately, right? And so, yes, Joe, you could call it advisory. I'm still going to call it thought sanctuary.
I love both terms.
Yeah.
Now, Kass, I'm sure that there are folks listening who have questions for you or who wish to learn more about your work and maybe some of the professional development offerings that you and Cornelius both offer. So how may they reach out to you?
Absolutely. So our website, kassandcorn.com. So KASSANDCORN.com is where you will find everything. Specifically, if you go to my page, there's a Teaching Fiercely page you'll see on there. There's my professional development offering specifically. We also have a newsletter that is chock full of resources and ways to reach us on the website. And you can also contact us via our website as well. So I am more than excited to connect with other educators who are really committed to school transformation or maybe just starting their commitment. Either way, please reach out, connect. I'm also very present on social media. You can find me at MSKASS1 on both Instagram and Twitter. So I really look forward to hearing from you and building community.
Kass Miner, this has been an absolute delight and pleasure. And I'm so grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule today to visit with us on We Have Issues. You have a strong sense of social justice and a deep appreciation for project-based instruction, for joy, for justice in our schools and our communities. And the heart in what you do is quite evident, even beyond the academic of what you do. The heart drives that, and without the heart, it's just everybody else's ideas put into different form. But the heart gives it its energy and its strength. So thank you so much for giving us your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe. I've loved being here with you.
Thank you. Well, that concludes this episode of We Have Issues, where we examine important issues throughout the educational community. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Have a wonderful day.